The rhythmic hum of the dishwasher was the only sound in the house, an unwelcome reminder of just how quiet life had become. Diane stood at the kitchen window, staring at the fading sunlight filtering through the trees. Her hands absent-mindedly twisted the plain gold band around her finger. She had worn it for almost 3 decades, a testament to a marriage that had long since slipped into the monotonous lull of routine. The late afternoon glow of the sun cast a golden hue on the countertops, highlighting the little imperfections she once overlooked. Now, every chip and scratch seemed like a metaphor for her life, worn down but still functional. Jim, her husband, was late again, a last-minute meeting he'd texted earlier. Diane didn't even bother to keep dinner warm anymore. It would end up in the microwave, reheated and tasteless, like so much of their interaction these days. She sighed, leaning her forehead against the cool glass of the window. Outside, suburban streets stretched out in familiar patterns, their charm dulled by years of repetition. Children played on bikes, their laughter faintly carried on the breeze, a distant echo of a life she once had, busy, vibrant, and full. The buzz of her phone on the counter jolted her from her thoughts. It was a text from her nephew, Ben, confirming his visit. "Can't wait to see you, Aunt Diane. Bringing a buddy. Hope that's okay." Diane smiled faintly. At least there was something to look forward to. Ben's visits were a rare bright spot. His youthful energy reminded her of days when her own children had filled the house with noise and chaos, before they'd grown up and moved away. She hadn't thought much about Ben's friend Chris beyond the brief mention. "A buddy," she murmured aloud, letting the word roll off her tongue without much thought. As the afternoon turned to evening, Diane busied herself preparing snacks, a ritual she secretly enjoyed. The predictability of slicing cheese and arranging crackers on a plate gave her a strange comfort. When the doorbell rang, she wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to the door, grateful for the distraction. Standing on the porch was Ben, his boyish grin as warm as ever, and beside him was Chris, a presence that immediately caught her attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, giving him an air of easy charm. His confidence seemed natural, not forced, and when his eyes met hers, Diane felt an unexpected jolt of awareness. "Hey, Aunt Diane!" Ben stepped forward, wrapping her in a warm hug. His familiar energy washed over her like a comforting blanket. "Then it's so good to see you." She turned her attention to the stranger. "And you must be Chris," she said, extending her hand. Chris took it, his grip firm but not overpowering. "Nice to meet you, ma'am," he said, his voice rich and smooth with a faintly playful undertone. Diane laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Call me Diane. Ma'am makes me feel ancient." "All right, Diane," Chris replied with a smile that lingered a moment longer than expected. The trio moved into the living room, where Ben sprawled comfortably on the couch while Chris took a seat at the far end, his posture relaxed but attentive. Diane settled into her favorite armchair, the one closest to the window. It had been her perch for years, offering the best view of the outside world. A small luxury in her otherwise routine life. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from Ben's plans to Chris's career as a freelance photographer. Chris's stories about his travels captivated Diane in a way she hadn't anticipated. He described places she'd only ever dreamed of, coastal cliffs at sunrise, bustling markets in foreign cities, and quiet forests where time seemed to stand still. His words painted vivid pictures, and Diane found herself leaning forward, hanging on every detail. "You must have some incredible photos," Diane said, her voice tinged with admiration. Chris nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. I do, but honestly, it's the moments behind the camera that matter most. Sometimes it's not about the shot, it's about the experience. His eyes flicked to Diane as he spoke, and she felt a warmth rise in her cheeks. She glanced away quickly, hoping neither man noticed. As the conversation turned to lighter topics, Diane's attention kept drifting back to Chris. There was something magnetic about him, a quiet confidence that reminded her of a younger version of herself, bold and unafraid to dream. She found herself laughing at his jokes, her voice lighter than it had been in years. When Ben excused himself to take a phone call, Diane suddenly felt the weight of Chris's presence more acutely. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged, as though an invisible thread connected them in a way she couldn't quite understand. You have a lovely home, Chris said, his gaze sweeping the room. Thank you, Diane replied, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle on her jeans. It's nothing fancy, but it served us well. Chris leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. It's not about the house, though, is it? It's about the people in it. Diane blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. That's true, she said, softly. When Ben re-entered the room, the moment dissipated, but Diane couldn't shake the feeling that Chris had seen through the carefully constructed facade of her life. As the evening wore on, the boys eventually said their goodbyes, leaving Diane alone in the quiet house once more. She stood in the doorway, watching their car disappear down the street, a strange sense of loss settling in her chest. That night, as she lay in bed scrolling through her phone, Diane found herself thinking about Chris. She replayed snippets of their conversation, the way his eyes had lingered just a second too long, the warmth in his voice when he said her name. Her cheeks flushed at the memory, and she scolded herself for letting her thoughts wander. Still, the spark he'd ignited was undeniable. The next morning, Diane woke with an unfamiliar energy. She found herself humming as she tidied the kitchen, her movements lighter, more deliberate. When she caught her reflection in the microwave's polished surface, she noticed a flush in her cheeks she hadn't seen in years. She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. For the first time in a long while, Diane felt alive. The day after Ben and Chris's visit, Diane couldn't shake the lingering warmth that had settled in her chest, the conversations, the laughter, and especially Chris's disarming presence. It all replayed in her mind like a favorite song. She scolded herself every time her thoughts drifted back to him, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. It was late afternoon when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, expecting a reminder from Jim about another late meeting, but instead it was a text from Ben. Hey, Aunt Diane, Chris and I are out running errands nearby. He wanted me to ask if you'd like to join us for lunch. Totally casual. Diane stared at the message for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. It was an innocent invitation. Nothing more, she told herself. But the thought of seeing Chris again brought a flutter of nerves that she hadn't felt in years. She hesitated, typing and deleting her reply 3 times before finally sending, "Sure, why not? Let me know where to meet." 20 minutes later, Diane found herself pulling into the parking lot of a small cafe on the edge of town. It was a charming spot she hadn't been to in years, its rustic decor and sunlit patio inviting and relaxed. She spotted Ben and Chris at a table near the window, laughing about something as they sipped their drinks. "Hey, there she is!" Ben waved as Diane approached, his grin as infectious as always. Chris turned, his smile widening when he saw her. "Diane! Good to see you again," he said, standing briefly in a gesture of politeness that caught her off guard. "You too," Diane replied, her cheeks warming as she took a seat. The conversation was easy and light-hearted at first. They joked about Ben's college antics and shared stories about family gatherings. But as the meal progressed, Diane noticed Chris directing his attention toward her more and more. He asked thoughtful questions about her life, her hobbies, and even her dreams, questions that caught her off guard, as if he could sense how rarely she thought about such things anymore. "What about you, Diane?" Chris asked, his gaze steady. "What's something you've always wanted to do but never had the chance?" Diane hesitated, the question startling in its simplicity. She glanced at Ben, who was distracted by his phone, before returning her gaze to Chris. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "It's been so long since I've thought about myself that way." Chris's smile was soft, understanding. "Maybe it's time to start thinking about it again." His words lingered with her even as the lunch wound down. When Ben excused himself to take a call outside, Diane and Chris were left alone at the table. The air between them seemed to shift, the light-hearted banter replaced by something heavier, more intimate. "You know," Chris said, leaning forward slightly, "I think you're underselling yourself. You've got a spark, Diane. I saw it the first time we met." Diane's breath caught, her pulse quickening. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Chris chuckled softly, sitting back in his chair. "Sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I just think people should hear it when they've still got something special." Diane smiled faintly, her heart racing as she tried to dismiss the sudden warmth blooming in her chest. "That's kind of you to say," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben returned shortly after, breaking the spell. As they finished their drinks and prepared to leave, Diane found herself wishing the moment could last just a little longer. On the drive home, she replayed the lunch in her mind. Chris's words had stirred something in her, something she thought had been buried under years of routine and responsibility. She felt seen in a way that she hadn't in years, and the feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. Later that evening, as she sat alone in the living room with a book she wasn't really reading, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Chris himself. "It was great seeing you today. Hope we didn't keep you out too long." Diane stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. "Not at all, it was nice," she finally replied. His response came almost immediately. "Let's do it again sometime, just us." Diane's heart pounded as she read the words. She knew what she should say, that it wasn't appropriate, that she couldn't. But as her fingers hovered over the screen, all she could think about was the way Chris had looked at her, the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her reply was brief but left the door open. "We'll see." The days after Chris's message were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions for Diane. She oscillated between guilt and excitement, replaying their conversation at the cafe over and over in her mind. She knew she should feel ashamed for entertaining his interest, but every time she thought of his easy smile and the way he made her feel noticed, a spark of something long dormant flared inside her. Jim remained oblivious to the quiet storm brewing within Diane. His work habits hadn't changed, late nights at the office, followed by hurried dinners and evenings spent glued to his laptop. Diane found herself studying him during these moments, searching for traces of the man she had once been so deeply in love with. But all she saw was routine, predictability, and a comfort that bordered on complacency. The next text from Chris came 3 days later. "I'm heading to the park to shoot some photos this afternoon. Come join me? You could use a change of scenery." Diane dipped her pencil in the ink. Diane stared at the message, her fingers trembling over the screen. She typed a response, deleted it, and then typed again. "I shouldn't," she finally wrote. But even as she hit send, she felt a pang of disappointment. Chris's reply came almost instantly. "Life's too short for shouldn'ts. Think about it." She did think about it, obsessively. By late afternoon, she found herself standing in front of the mirror, smoothing out imaginary wrinkles on her blouse. "It's just a walk in the park," she told herself, but the quickened pace of her heartbeat betrayed her. She grabbed her purse and keys before she could change her mind. The park was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. Diane spotted Chris near a small pond, his camera slung casually over his shoulder. He waved when he saw her, his grin as warm and inviting as ever. "You made it," he said, his voice carrying just the right amount of triumph. "I did," Diane replied, unable to stop the smile tugging at her lips. They walked along the winding paths, the conversation flowing easily. Chris pointed out angles and lighting tricks, explaining his process with an enthusiasm that was contagious. Diane found herself laughing more than she had in months, the sound foreign but exhilarating. At one point, Chris crouched near a cluster of flowers, angling his camera to capture the way the sunlight filtered through the petals. "Come look," he said, gesturing for Diane to join him. She knelt beside him, their shoulders brushing as she peered at the camera's screen. The closeness made her breath hitch, and when Chris turned to look at her, she realized just how close they were. "You've got an eye for beauty," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. "So, do you?" he replied, his tone soft but weighted. The moment stretched, and for the first time Diane didn't look away. She wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly Chris's lips were on hers, gentle at first, testing, as if he was waiting for her to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned into the kiss, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as if she might fall without it. When they finally broke apart, Diane's chest was heaving, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, and none at all. "I shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice shaky. Chris reached for her hand, his touch grounding. "Then why didn't you stop me?" She had no answer because deep down she didn't regret it, not entirely. The drive home was a blur. Diane barely remembered getting into her car or how she managed to navigate the familiar streets back to her house. All she could think about was the way Chris's lips had felt against hers, the way her body had responded, as if it had been waiting for this moment for years. At home, the guilt finally caught up with her. Jim was in the living room, engrossed in a spreadsheet on his laptop. He looked up briefly when she entered. "Hey, how was your day?" he asked, his tone perfunctory. "Fine," Diane replied quickly, retreating to the kitchen under the pretense of preparing dinner. Her hands trembled as she chopped vegetables, her mind replaying the kiss over and over. She felt like she was living a double life, torn between the security of her marriage and the intoxicating thrill of something forbidden. That night, she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling as guilt and desire waged war within her. She thought of ending things with Chris, of cutting off contact before it went any further. But even as she resolved to do so, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. "I can't stop thinking about you," the message read. Diane's heart raced as she typed her reply. "Neither can I." The next week was a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered conversations. Diane and Chris met twice more, always under the guise of something innocent. A quick coffee, a walk around the neighborhood. But the connection between them grew stronger with each encounter. the line between right and wrong blurring until it was almost unrecognizable. It was during one of these meetings that Chris suggested something bolder. "Let me take you somewhere," he said, his tone conspiratorial. "Chris, I don't know," Diane began, but he cut her off with a grin. "Trust me," he said. It'll be worth it." An hour later, they were parked on a hill overlooking the city, the skyline glittering like a sea of stars against the night sky. Diane's breath caught as she stepped out of the car, the view more beautiful than she could have imagined. Chris joined her, his hands tucked into his pockets as he stood beside her. "It's my favorite spot," he said. "I come here when I need to think." "It's incredible," Diane replied, her voice tinged with awe. Chris turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to share it with you," he said softly. Diane felt her resolve weakening. The way he looked at her, like she was the most important thing in the world, it was intoxicating. She hadn't felt this seen, this desired, in years. Without thinking, she closed the distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that was hungrier, more desperate than the last. Chris responded instantly, his arms wrapping around her as he pulled her close. For a moment, there was no guilt, no second-guessing, just the two of them, lost in a world that felt entirely their own. The drive home that night was quiet. Chris reached over to hold Diane's hand, his thumb tracing small circles against her skin. "You're incredible," he said, his voice low and sincere. Diane smiled, though her heart ached with the weight of what they were doing. "You don't know me," she said softly. Chris glanced at her, his expression serious. "I know enough to see how amazing you are, and I think you've forgotten that about yourself." His words stayed with her long after she returned home. As she slipped into bed beside Jim, who was already asleep, Diane felt tears sting her eyes. She didn't know how she had ended up here, caught between two worlds, but one thing was clear: she couldn't go back to the way things were. Diane woke the next morning with a mix of exhilaration and dread coursing through her veins. The memory of the kiss with Chris lingered, vivid and electric. Yet, lying beside her husband, Jim, she couldn't ignore the pang of guilt gnawing at her. As sunlight streamed through the blinds, Diane turned to face the reality she had been avoiding. Jim stirred awake, his groggy voice cutting through the silence. "Morning," he muttered, not looking her way as he reached for his phone. "That's not true." "Morning," Diane replied softly, but Jim was already absorbed in emails, his usual routine. The distance between them, once an unspoken sadness, now felt like a justification. Diane hated herself for the thought, but it was there, undeniable. As the day stretched on, Chris's name lit up her phone again. "Can we talk? I need to see you." Diane stared at the message, her stomach flipping. She had resolved to put some space between them, to regain control of a situation spiraling faster than she could handle. Yet her fingers betrayed her. "Where?" Chris suggested a small cafe on the outskirts of town, a place quiet enough to promise discretion. Diane arrived early, her nerves fraying with each passing minute. When Chris walked in, her breath hitched. He looked effortlessly confident, as always, but there was something softer in his eyes as he approached her table. "You came," he said, relief evident in his tone as he slid into the seat across from her. "I shouldn't have," Diane replied, her voice tinged with regret. Chris leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted. "And I know this is complicated, messy even, but I can't pretend this doesn't mean something." Diane's throat tightened. "It does," she admitted quietly, her heart pounding. "But I don't know how to handle this. I have a life, a marriage." Chris reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "A life that makes you happy?" His question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken for far too long. Diane didn't answer. She couldn't. The silence spoke volumes, and Chris nodded as if he understood. "I don't want to ruin anything for you," he said finally, his voice low, "but I also don't want to walk away from this. From you." The intensity in his gaze made Diane's resolve waver. "I don't know what I want," she confessed, tears threatening to spill. Chris squeezed her hand gently. "Then let me help you figure it out. No pressure, no expectations, just be with me." The next few weeks unfolded in a blur of stolen moments and quiet rendezvous. Diane and Chris found solace in each other, their connection deepening with every conversation, every touch. It wasn't just physical, though the chemistry between them was undeniable. It was emotional. Chris listened in a way Jim hadn't in years, his attention unwavering and genuine. One afternoon, Chris surprised Diane with a small gift, a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm. "I saw this and thought of you," he said, fastening it around her wrist as they sat together in his car, parked at a secluded overlook. Diane stared at the charm, a tiny leaf etched with intricate veins, and felt a lump form in her throat. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're beautiful," Chris replied, his fingers lingering on her wrist. The gesture felt dangerously intimate, and Diane knew she should refuse it, but she couldn't bring herself to take it off. It was the first time in years someone had made her feel cherished. At home, the cracks in Diane's facade began to show. Jim noticed her distracted air, the way she seemed lost in thought during dinner, or spent more time out of the house than usual. "You've been busy lately," he remarked one evening, his tone casual but probing. "Just catching up with old friends," Diane lied smoothly, forcing a smile. Jim nodded, accepting the answer without further question, but Diane felt the weight of her deception pressing down on her. She tried to focus on her marriage, to reconnect with the man she had once loved so deeply. She cooked Jim's favorite meals, planned a weekend getaway, and even initiated conversations about his work and hobbies. But her efforts felt hollow, forced. Her mind always drifted back to Chris, to the way he made her feel alive. One evening, as Diane sat in the living room scrolling through her phone, a text from Chris popped up. "I miss you." Her heart raced as she typed her reply. "I miss you too." The door creaked open and Diane quickly locked her phone. Jim stepped in, looking weary but content. "You ready for bed?" he asked. "Yeah," Diane replied, slipping the phone into her pocket. As she followed him upstairs, guilt gnawed at her again. She wanted to feel satisfied in her marriage, to be the devoted wife she had promised to be. But the longing for Chris was a pull she couldn't resist. Things came to a head one Saturday when Chris showed up unannounced at Diane's home. Jim was out running errands and Diane had been tidying the kitchen when the knock at the door startled her. Chris stood on the porch, his hands in his pockets and an apologetic smile on his face. "You can't just show up here," Diane hissed, glancing over her shoulder to make sure the house was empty. "I know," Chris said, "but I needed to see you." Diane stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "This is too risky," she said, her voice trembling. Chris took a step closer, his expression earnest. "I'm not trying to complicate things more than they already are. I just—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." Diane's resolve crumbled. She reached for his hand, pulling him to the side of the house where they couldn't be seen from the street. "You're going to get us caught," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. Chris smiled, his relief palpable. "I'll take my chances." The tension between them was unbearable. Diane reached up, pulling Chris into a kiss that was desperate and hungry, a collision of emotions too powerful to contain. When they finally broke apart, Chris rested his forehead against hers. "I'll leave if you want me to," he said quietly. Diane shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't know what I want," she whispered. Chris pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "Then let's figure it out together," he murmured. That evening, Diane stood in the shower, letting the hot water cascade over her as she tried to make sense of her tangled emotions. She couldn't keep living this double life, but the thought of giving up either Chris or her marriage felt unbearable. Her phone buzzed on the bathroom counter, and she stepped out, wrapping a towel around herself before glancing at the screen. It was a message from Chris. "I meant what I said. I'll wait as long as it takes." Diane's heart ached as she typed her response. "I don't deserve you." Chris's reply came swiftly. "You deserve everything, and I want to give it to you." As Diane climbed into bed that night, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't continue like this, torn between two lives. A decision would have to be made, one that would change everything. Diane woke the next morning with the uneasy weight of her choices pressing heavily against her chest. The house was still quiet. Jim was already at the office, as usual. She wandered into the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the empty street. The quietness, once a comfort, now felt like a vacuum pulling her deeper into her spiraling emotions. Her phone buzzed on the counter and her stomach flipped. It was Chris. "Good morning. Thinking about you. I hope you're okay." She hesitated before typing back. "We need to talk." Chris responded quickly. "When and where?" She stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "Tonight, the park." The day dragged on, every minute a slow march toward the inevitable. Diane busied herself with chores, but her mind was elsewhere. She rehearsed what she would say to Chris, trying to find the words to end things without completely shattering the fragile connection they had built. She didn't know if she was strong enough to let him go, but she knew she couldn't keep deceiving Jim or herself. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Diane found herself sitting on a bench in the park, the cool evening air nipping at her skin. Chris arrived shortly after, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Hey," he said, sitting down beside her. "Hey," Diane replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris studied her, his brow furrowing. "What's wrong?" Diane took a deep breath, bracing herself. "Chris, we can't keep doing this." His face fell, the easy confidence replaced by a flicker of vulnerability. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this has to stop," Diane said, her voice trembling. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I'm doing." Chris reached for her hand, his touch grounding. "You're finding yourself," he said softly. "That's not something to be ashamed of." "But at what cost?" Diane's voice broke, tears streaming down her face. "Jim doesn't deserve this, and you deserve someone who can give you everything, not just stolen moments." Chris was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't care about the circumstances," he said finally. "I care about you. You make me feel alive, Diane. I can't just walk away from that." His words struck a chord deep within her, but the guilt was too overwhelming. She pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold herself together. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice barely audible. Chris leaned closer, his eyes searching hers. "Look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel the same way. Tell me this doesn't mean anything to you." Diane's breath hitched. She couldn't lie, not to him, not to herself. "It does," she admitted, her voice shaking. "It means everything. But that doesn't make it right." Chris closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his face. When he opened them again, they were filled with determination. "Then let me make it right. Leave him, Diane. Be with me." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Diane's heart raced as she considered the enormity of what he was asking. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Jim. "Where are you? I'm home early. Everything okay?" The blood drained from Diane's face as she read the message. She stood abruptly, panic setting in. "I have to go," she said, her voice frantic. "Diane, wait," Chris began, but she was already walking away, her heart pounding in her chest. When Diane arrived home, Jim was waiting in the living room, his face etched with concern. "Hey," he said, standing as she walked in. "I was starting to worry. Where were you?" Diane forced a smile, her hands trembling. "I just went for a walk. I needed some air." Jim studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been distant lately," he said. "Is everything okay?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment Diane considered telling him the truth. But the words caught in her throat, the weight of them too heavy to bear. "I'm fine," she said finally, her voice hollow. Jim didn't look convinced, but he let it go, retreating back to his laptop. Diane watched him, guilt twisting in her gut. She knew she couldn't keep living like this. The next day, Diane woke to find Jim gone, a note on the counter saying he'd be working late. She stared at the note, her mind racing. This was her chance to confront her feelings, to figure out what she truly wanted. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and dialed Chris's number. "Diane?" he answered, his voice filled with hope. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Always," Chris replied. They met at Chris's apartment, a modest but cozy space filled with photos from his travels. Diane stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say, until Chris pulled her into his arms. "I missed you," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. Diane clung to him, the weight of her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Chris, I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice breaking. Chris pulled back, his hands cupping her face. "You don't have to decide everything right now," he said gently. "Just be here. Be with me." For the first time in weeks, Diane let herself relax. She allowed herself to feel the warmth of his embrace, the comfort of his presence. In that moment, the chaos of her life faded, replaced by a quiet certainty. She couldn't walk away from this. But as the night wore on, reality crept back in. Diane knew she couldn't keep running from the truth. She had to make a choice, one that would change everything. Diane drove home from Chris's apartment in silence, the weight of the evening pressing heavily on her chest. The warmth of his embrace lingered, but so did the stark reality of her situation. She couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't live split between two lives. Chris had offered her a version of happiness she hadn't felt in years, but the cost of reaching for it loomed large. When she pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. Jim's car was absent, confirming he was still at the office. Diane sat in the driver's seat, staring at the home she had built with him over decades. It felt both familiar and foreign now, a place where her heart had once thrived but had since withered. Inside, the silence of the house was deafening. Diane poured herself a glass of wine, her hands trembling as she sat at the kitchen table. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. "Chris, thinking about you. Let me know you got home safe." Her heart twisted at the sight of his name. Chris was everything Jim hadn't been in years, attentive, passionate, alive. But could she truly leave behind the life she'd built, the stability she'd clung to for so long? She typed a quick reply, "I'm home, thank you." Chris's response came immediately. "I meant what I said. I'll wait for you, Diane, as long as it takes." The next morning, Jim was uncharacteristically home for breakfast. Diane found him sitting at the table, a mug of coffee in his hands. He glanced up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Diane replied, her voice tight. Jim set down his mug, his brow furrowing. "We need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. "About what?" Jim sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've noticed something's off. You've been distant, distracted. It feels like we're not on the same page anymore." Diane's throat tightened, her pulse quickening. She struggled to form a response, the words sticking in her throat. "I know I haven't been as present as I should be," Jim continued. "Work has consumed me, and I've taken you for granted. But if something's wrong, if I've done something, I need to know." Diane looked away, guilt clawing at her. "It's not just you," she admitted softly. "It's me too. I've been lost." Jim's eyes softened. "Then let's find our way back. Together." His words should have comforted her, but instead they felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Was it too late to fix what they'd lost? And did she even want to? That evening, Diane met Chris at the park again. The twilight painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, but Diane's heart felt heavy. "I talked to Jim," she said, her voice trembling. Chris tensed. "And he knows something's wrong," Diane admitted, "but he wants to fix it." Chris's jaw tightened, and he turned away, staring out at the horizon. "What about you?" he asked after a moment. "I don't know," Diane said honestly. I care about him, but it's different now. And then there's you." Chris faced her, his eyes filled with intensity. "Do you love him?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Did she? She cared for Jim, yes. She respected him. But love? The kind of love that made her heart race, that consumed her thoughts? She hadn't felt that in years. "I don't know," she whispered. Chris stepped closer, his voice low. "And what about me? Do you love me?" Tears welled in Diane's eyes as she looked at him. "Yes," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But that doesn't make this any easier." Chris reached for her hands, his grip firm but gentle. "Then don't overthink it. Follow your heart. Be with me." Diane wanted to say yes, to throw caution to the wind and choose the passion Chris offered. But the weight of her marriage, her history with Jim, held her back. "I need time," she said, finally pulling her hands away. Chris's face fell, but he nodded. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "I'll be here." The following days were a blur of emotions. Diane threw herself into her routines, hoping the structure would offer clarity, but the conflict within her only grew. Jim, for his part, made a noticeable effort to reconnect. He came home earlier, asked about her day, and even suggested a weekend getaway. But every gesture, every attempt to bridge the gap felt forced. Diane couldn't ignore the hollowness in her responses, the way her thoughts drifted to Chris at every opportunity. One evening, as Jim sat beside her on the couch, Diane felt an overwhelming sense of suffocation. She couldn't do this anymore. "I need to go for a drive," she said abruptly, standing up. Jim looked surprised, but didn't protest. "Okay," he said, watching her leave. Diane found herself parked outside Chris's apartment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She hadn't planned to come here, but her heart had guided her to the one place that felt right. Chris opened the door moments after she knocked, his expression a mix of surprise and hope. "I couldn't stay away," Diane admitted, her voice shaking. Chris pulled her into his arms, his embrace warm and familiar. "You don't have to," he said softly. As they stood together, Diane felt a sense of peace for the first time in weeks. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she knew she couldn't deny her heart any longer. The days following Diane's decision to embrace her connection with Chris were both exhilarating and fraught with tension. Every moment spent with him felt like a stolen treasure, a glimpse into a life where she felt alive and desired. Yet the weight of her deception hung over her like a storm cloud, growing heavier with each passing day. Jim's efforts to reconnect had not waned. He began coming home earlier, making conversation over dinner, and even suggesting a weekend getaway to the mountains. Diane tried to mirror his enthusiasm, but her heart wasn't in it. She felt like an imposter, playing the role of a devoted wife, while half her soul belonged elsewhere. One evening, Jim arrived home earlier than usual, surprising Diane as she stood in the kitchen texting Chris. She quickly locked her phone, but Jim's narrowed eyes caught the movement. "Who are you texting?" he asked casually, but there was an edge to his tone. "Just Ben," Diane replied smoothly, her heart pounding. "He wanted to know if I could help him with something this weekend." Jim nodded, but his expression didn't soften. He lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, his eyes occasionally darting toward her phone on the counter. Diane felt a chill of unease settle over her, but she pushed it aside, brushing off his suspicion as paranoia. The breaking point came the following weekend. Diane had told Jim she was meeting an old friend for lunch, but instead, she met Chris at a cozy inn on the outskirts of town. The hours they spent together were a blur of laughter, stolen kisses, and whispered promises. For the first time in years, Diane felt completely free, untethered from the constraints of her life with Jim. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Diane reluctantly began to gather her things. "I should go," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "Jim's expecting me." Chris walked her to her car, his hand lingering on hers as she opened the door. "You don't have to go back," he said softly. "You could stay. With me." Diane's heart ached at the sincerity in his voice. "I can't," she whispered. "Not yet." Chris nodded, his disappointment evident but unspoken. "I'll wait," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "As long as it takes." When Diane arrived home, the house was eerily quiet. She called out for Jim, but there was no response. A flicker of panic rose in her chest as she stepped into the living room and found him sitting on the couch, his expression dark and unreadable. On the coffee table in front of him sat her phone, the series of unread messages from Chris. "Who's Chris?" Jim asked, his voice low and steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of anger beneath it. Diane's breath caught in her throat. Jim, I can explain. Don't, he interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't insult me by pretending there's a reasonable explanation for this. Diane's mind raced, searching for words that might soften the blow, but none came. The truth hung heavy in the air, undeniable and inescapable. How long? Jim asked, his voice breaking. How long have you been lying to me? Tears welled in Diane's eyes as she sank into the chair opposite him. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Jim laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and grating. That doesn't answer my question. Diane hesitated, the weight of her confession pressing down on her. A few months, she admitted quietly. Jim stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. A few months, he repeated, his tone incredulous. How could you do this to us? To me? It wasn't about you, Diane said, her voice rising in frustration. It was about me, about how I felt invisible for years, like I'm just a part of the furniture in this house. Jim stopped pacing, turning to face her with a look of hurt and anger. So this is my fault? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You're blaming me for your infidelity? I'm not blaming anyone, Diane said, her tears flowing freely now. I'm just trying to make you understand. Understand what? Jim snapped. That you found someone else? That I wasn't enough for you? Mm-hmm. Diane looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know how to explain it. Jim sat back down, his shoulders slumping as the anger gave way to despair. I thought we were happy, he said, his voice barely audible. I thought we were a team. We were, Diane said, her voice thick with emotion. But somewhere along the way, we lost each other, and I didn't know how to find my way back. The days that followed were a blur of tense conversations and icy silences. Jim moved into the guest bedroom, his presence in the house a constant reminder of the pain they were both struggling to process. Diane found herself walking on eggshells, unsure of how to navigate the fragile terrain of their relationship. Chris texted her regularly, his messages filled with concern and longing. Diane responded sporadically, torn between her desire to see him and her guilt over the devastation she had caused at home. She knew she couldn't continue living in this limbo, but the path forward felt impossibly unclear. One evening, Jim approached her in the kitchen, his expression weary but determined. We need to decide what happens next, he said. Diane nodded, her stomach twisting in knots. I know. I'm not going to beg you to stay, Jim said, his voice firm, but I need to know if there's anything left to fight for. Diane's heart ached at the vulnerability in his words. She wanted to believe there was still something worth salvaging, but she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward Chris, the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. I need time, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jim nodded, his expression a mix of resignation and sadness. Take it, he said, but know that I deserve honesty, Diane. No more lies. Diane retreated to her favorite bench in the park, the place where she and Chris had shared so many quiet moments together. The autumn leaves swirled around her, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray cloud of uncertainty that hung over her. Chris appeared moments later, his presence both comforting and heartbreaking. He sat beside her, his hand brushing hers in a gesture of reassurance. Tell me what you're thinking, he said gently. Diane took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I'm thinking that I've made a mess of everything, she said, and I don't know how to fix it. Chris was silent for a moment, his hand closing around hers. You don't have to fix everything, he said. Just figure out what makes you happy. And if it's not me, I'll understand. Diane turned to him, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know if I can walk away from you, she admitted, but I don't know if I can leave him either. Chris leaned closer, his voice soft but firm. Then take your time, he said. I'll wait. As Diane sat there, torn between two lives, she realized that her decision would define not just her future, but the futures of everyone involved. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel the weight of that responsibility fully. Diane spent the next few days in a daze, navigating her fractured life with the bare minimum of effort. Her conversations with Jim were clipped and awkward, marked by long silences and moments of palpable tension. At the same time, her exchanges with Chris were bittersweet, filled with warmth, but tainted by the knowledge that every moment with him was a betrayal. She couldn't continue like this. She had to make a choice. One crisp autumn afternoon, Diane decided to take a long walk to clear her head. The cool air felt sharp against her skin, each step crunching against the scattered leaves on the pavement. Her feet led her to the small cafe where she and Chris had shared one of their first secret moments together. The memories washed over her like a wave. His smile, the way he leaned in when he spoke, his quiet understanding. She sat at a corner table, ordering tea she didn't drink, and let her mind wander. The life she had with Jim was stable and familiar, a foundation built over decades. But in the past few years, it had felt less like a partnership and more like a routine. Chris was the opposite, unpredictable, exciting, and passionate. With him, she felt seen, desired, and alive in ways she hadn't in years. The thought of choosing one and losing the other left her paralyzed. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was Chris. Thinking about you. Can we talk tonight? She stared at the message, her chest tightening. She typed a quick reply. Not tonight. I need some time. Chris responded almost immediately. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. That evening, Diane sat across from Jim at the dinner table. He was unusually quiet, his focus more on the glass of wine in his hand than the food on his plate. Diane studied him, noting the lines on his face that had deepened over the years, the tired slump of his shoulders. She thought of how much they had been through together, raising 2 children, losing her mother, his career ups and downs. Their history wasn't something she could easily cast aside. Jim, she began, breaking the silence. He looked up, his eyes guarded. Yeah? I think we need to talk, Diane said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Jim set his glass down and leaned back in his chair, his expression wary. I've been waiting for you to say that. Diane took a deep breath. I don't even know where to start, but I owe you honesty. Jim nodded slowly. Okay, I'm listening. I felt lost for a long time, Diane said, choosing her words carefully. Like somewhere along the way we stopped seeing each other, and I didn't know how to fix it, so I made a mistake, a big one. Jim's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I let someone else into my life, Diane admitted, her voice breaking. Someone who made me feel alive again. but it wasn't fair to you or to me. Jim sat in stunned silence for a moment, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "So, you're in love with someone else?" he asked, his voice heavy with pain. Diane hesitated, then nodded. "I think I am, but that doesn't mean I don't care about you. I do. I always will." Jim stood abruptly, pacing the length of the dining room. "This is a lot," he said, his voice trembling with anger and hurt. "Do you want to leave? Is that what this is?" "I don't know," Diane said, her own tears spilling over now. "I feel torn between the life we've built and the person I've become." Jim turned to face her, his expression raw. "The life we've built? Diane, we've been together for 30 years. We've raised kids. We've been through hell and back. And you're telling me that's not enough anymore?" "It's not about enough," Deanne said, her voice pleading. "It's about feeling alive, feeling like myself again." "And I couldn't give that to you?" Jim asked bitterly. Diane shook her head, her heart breaking at the pain in his voice. "It's not just about you, Jim. It's about me. It's about me. I've been lost for so long, and I didn't even realize it until I met him." Jim leaned against the wall, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "So, what now?" he asked quietly. The following days were consumed by long, difficult conversations. Diane and Jim revisited their past, picking apart the moments where they had drifted apart. They both owned their mistakes, Jim's neglect of their emotional connection, Diane's betrayal. It was painful and messy, but it was necessary. For the first time in years, they were truly honest with each other. Jim admitted he had taken their relationship for granted, assuming it would always be there, no matter how little attention he gave it. Diane confessed how deeply she had craved affection and validation, how lonely she had felt in their marriage. But the conversations didn't bring clarity. They only reinforced how complicated their relationship had become. One rainy afternoon, Diane drove to the park where she had so often met Chris. She found him sitting on their usual bench, staring out at the misty horizon. He looked up when she approached, his face lighting up despite the somber weather. "Hey," he said, standing to greet her. "Hi," Diane replied, her voice shaky. She sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. Chris studied her for a moment before speaking. "You've made a decision, haven't you?" Diane nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I have." Chris took a deep breath, bracing himself. "And?" "I can't leave Jim," Diane said, her voice breaking. "I've hurt him so much already, and I can't destroy what we've built. I owe it to him and to myself to try to fix what we have." Chris's face fell, but he nodded slowly, his eyes filled with sadness. "I get it," he said quietly. "I don't like it, but I get it." Diane reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You've given me so much, Chris. You reminded me of who I am, of what I deserve. I'll never forget that." Chris swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he fought back his own emotions. "I just want you to be happy," he said, "even if it's not with me." Tears spilled down Diane's cheeks as she leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his lips, a bittersweet farewell. "Thank you," she whispered. Chris smiled faintly, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Take care of yourself, Diane." Diane drove home that evening feeling both lighter and heavier. She had made her choice, but it wasn't an easy one. Rebuilding her marriage would take time, effort, and patience, but for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. She walked into the house to find Jim sitting in the living room, a tentative smile on his face. "You're home," he said. "I am," Deanne replied, sitting beside him. "And I'm ready to work on us, if you are." Jim nodded, his hand reaching for hers. "I am," he said. "It won't be easy, but I'm willing to try." Diane smiled, her heart heavy but determined. "So am I." As they sat together, hands entwined, Diane felt the first stirrings of possibility. It wouldn't be perfect, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but she was ready to face the future, whatever it held. The weeks following Diane's decision were a mix of rebuilding and reflection. She had chosen her marriage, but the process of repairing it felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm of doubts and what-ifs. Diane knew she had hurt Jim deeply, and while he was committed to working through their issues, the wounds were still fresh. Trust, once fractured, would take time to heal. Jim surprised Diane with how much he threw himself into mending their relationship. He arranged counseling sessions, something they had never considered before. Their first few meetings were awkward, filled with tense silences and moments of raw emotion. Diane found herself confessing truths she had buried for years. Her feelings of neglect, her yearning for attention, and the spark she had found with Chris. It wasn't just about the affair, she told their counselor during one session, her voice trembling. It was about feeling seen, about feeling like I mattered. Jim listened, his face tight with pain, but his gaze steady. "I thought I was doing enough," he admitted. "Providing for us, keeping things stable. I didn't realize how much I'd let go emotionally." Their counselor, a patient but firm woman named Margot, guided them toward understanding. "This isn't about assigning blame," she said. "It's about recognizing the needs that weren't being met, on both sides, and finding ways to reconnect." At Margot's suggestion, Jim and Diane began setting aside time to simply be together. No work, no distractions, just the two of them. They started small, evening walks around the neighborhood, shared meals without their phones, and even revisiting old memories through photo albums. Diane was struck by how easily they could laugh together when they allowed themselves to. She had forgotten that part of their relationship, the simple joy of companionship. One Saturday, Jim suggested they visit the cabin they used to rent in the mountains when their children were young. Diane hesitated at first, unsure if revisiting the past would feel forced, but Jim's enthusiasm convinced her. The cabin was just as she remembered, rustic and cozy, surrounded by towering pines. As they unpacked, Jim unearthed an old board game they used to play with the kids. "Remember this?" he asked, holding it up with a nostalgic smile. Diane laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. "I think we spent more time arguing over the rules than actually playing." That evening, as they sat by the fire, sipping wine and talking about everything and nothing, Diane felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the fiery passion she had found with Chris, but it was something deeper, a quiet, enduring bond that had weathered decades of life together. Despite her commitment to rebuilding her marriage, Diane couldn't completely banish Chris from her thoughts. He lingered at the edges of her mind, a bittersweet reminder of what could have been. She wondered if he was okay, if he had moved on, if he thought of her as often as she thought of him. One rainy afternoon, Diane decided to write him a letter. She wasn't sure if she would send it, but she needed to put her feelings into words. "I hope this finds you well. I've been thinking about you a lot, and I wanted to thank you for everything. You reminded me of parts of myself I had forgotten, and you gave me the courage to face truths I'd been avoiding for far too long. Letting you go was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, but I know it was the right one. My marriage deserves a chance, and so do I. But that doesn't mean what we shared wasn't real. It was, and it meant more to me than I can ever express. I hope you find someone who sees you the way you saw me, who makes you feel as alive as you made me feel. You deserve that, Chris. Take care of yourself, and thank you again for everything. Diane folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, unsure if she would ever have the courage to send it, but writing it brought her a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. Despite the progress Diane and Jim were making, the road was far from smooth. Jim had moments of anger and resentment that surfaced unexpectedly, often sparked by small, innocuous things. A text message notification on Diane's phone, a passing comment about her day. Diane couldn't blame him. She had shattered his trust, and rebuilding it would take time. One evening, as they sat in the living room watching TV, Jim suddenly turned to her. "Do you still think about him?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Diane froze, her heart pounding. "Sometimes," she admitted honestly, "but it doesn't mean I regret choosing us." Jim nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. I can't help wondering if I'll ever be enough for you again." "You are enough," Diane said, reaching for his hand. "But we have to rebuild this together. It's not going to be easy, but I want to try. I need you to try too." Jim squeezed her hand, his expression softening. "I am trying," he said, "but it's hard." "I know," Diane replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It's hard for me too." Months passed, and Diane and Jim continued to navigate the delicate process of healing. Their relationship wasn't the same as it had been before the affair, but in some ways it was stronger. They were more honest with each other, more intentional about their time together, and more willing to confront the issues that had once gone unspoken. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jim turned to Diane with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we'll ever get back to where we were?" he asked. Diane considered the question carefully. "I don't think we can," she said honestly. "But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we can build something better." Jim nodded, his gaze steady. "I'd like that," he said. Diane smiled, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. For the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. Not just for her marriage, but for herself. She wasn't the same woman she had been before Chris entered her life, and she wouldn't pretend to be. But she was stronger now, more aware of her own needs and desires, and that awareness, she realized, was a gift. One day, while cleaning out her desk, Diane came across the letter she had written to Chris. She held it in her hands for a long moment, then slipped it into her purse. Later that afternoon, she drove to the park where they had shared so many memories and sat on their favorite bench. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Diane pulled out the letter and read it one last time. Then, with a deep breath, she tore it into small pieces and let the wind carry them away. It was time to let go. For good. As she walked back to her car, Diane felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it, one step at a time. Diane's journey wasn't about choosing between two men. It was about rediscovering herself. Chris had awakened something in her, but it was her own courage and self-awareness that allowed her to make the hard decisions. Rebuilding her marriage was a challenge, but it was one she was willing to face, knowing that growth often came from the hardest moments. As she and Jim continued to move forward, Diane held on to the lessons she had learned. She vowed never to let herself feel invisible again, to advocate for her needs, and to nurture the parts of herself she had once ignored. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was an honest one, and for Diane, that was enough.